Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So, I've talked before about the potential or tendency Plato seems to have to, in a way, de-brainwash us, to kind of lighten our load, actually, by lifting off the burdensome assumptions we make about philosophy and perhaps even about our own heart's desire. Today we're looking at one of the passages where that tendency in Plato comes out particularly strikingly, and we're going to be talking about what that can do for us. You might remember the last episode saw us return to that startling and unforgettable dialogue, the symposium, which is a gathering that has about as little in common with the modern symposium as can be imagined. And the spot in the symposium we had returned to was this wonderful and really kind of consciousness expanding passage in which the prophetess Diotima had introduced this idea of the object of human desire being to reproduce in beauty, to beget or give birth in the beautiful. Our fundamental desire is to do this in body and also in soul or psyche. Now, she didn't really explain what she meant by this, and that's what she'll do for us today. And it's in doing that Diotima, I think, will burst apart these assumptions that weigh us down and will foster the growth of those wings of the psyche that we heard Socrates tell the young Phaedrus about in the dialogue of the same name, the Phaedrus. Will be lifted up. So I'm really talking about one assumption today, and it has to do with one of the things that makes the Platonic philosophy, the whole vast tradition of Platonic philosophy as it lived up through antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance, so different from philosophy as we often understand it in the modern West today. Especially, I think, in our Anglo-American world. It's undergirded, I think, by really a radically different idea of cognition, and overturning our modern preconception of what cognition is will in turn make a difference, I think, in how we're to understand what you could call the meaning or purpose of life. I think we saw this really kind of limited reading of Plato based in turn on this limited idea of cognition in some of the things we talked about in our last couple of episodes. These modern critiques of Plato, for example, the Heideggerian one that claimed Plato set in motion this forgetting of being by initiating a view of truth really as the mind's correspondence with an objective world. So a matter of correspondence, rather than a more immediate encounter with reality. And one thing I didn't mention last time is that this idea of truth that Heidegger attributes to Plato is the same idea of truth really that has held such sway in modern Western philosophy, I think especially in the English-speaking world since the Enlightenment. And then we saw, of course, how Heidegger's critique was put in questionable neuroscientific terms by Ian McGilchrist as a kind of domination of left-brained processing. So today we'll see how this view of Plato really doesn't hold up. There's been, in fact, a tendency in the West since the Enlightenment to assume Plato had this idea of truth because this is how truth has been so often conceived by Western philosophy itself since the Enlightenment. And actually, in seeing how it doesn't hold up, we'll also come closer to understanding what Diotima means when she says humans desire to reproduce in beauty. This all happens when we return to this passage and read on. So what makes this passage so hard to reconcile with this modern understanding of cognition and of Plato himself? Well, if we understand Plato to be about correspondence with objective reality, we'd naturally imagine that for him, the the end, or if you like, ultimate object of human desire would be to know the good or beautiful or the one. And since Plato's ideas like the good or the beautiful or the one, which I think really are interchangeable certainly in the Platonic tradition as a whole, and I think they probably were for Plato himself too, even if it's somewhat coded in his dialogues. That correspondence of the good and beautiful to the one. And since his ideas like the good or beautiful or one are fixed and eternal, we'd expect that satisfaction of our desire to lie in the attainment of a fixed idea, in there being in our minds an idea, an abstraction that corresponds to this objective principle of reality that is fixed and stable as it is. It's like there'd be a kind of final answer, like we see in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, where we finally reach this concept of the cause of reality and basically sort of win the game of life. And this way of thinking is also successfully lampooned in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, where the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything, of course, ends up being 42. And at the risk of spoiling, we'll see later Diotima put the climax of this quest of philosophy, which is also the quest of life, in terms that might suggest something like this, that there is, in some way, a sense in which we attain to a kind of final answer as the climax of a ladder-like process. And this passage, where Diotima will walk us up this ladder of Eros, is itself really the climax of the symposium. And talking about it will be, for us too, really the climax of this series. But when we come to it, it just may occur to us, amid the sense of wonder that that passage may inspire in us, also a sense that there's something kind of obviously amiss about it, at least if we take it in a literal sense. And that is, do we ever really get to the top of the ladder of life, to a point at which we have attained the absolute good itself? Not only does that seem kind of counterintuitive, something hard to conceive for finite beings like us, but also, if it were simply attainable in a final way like that, we would have to wonder, what is now the point of living? There cannot be any more good to enjoy than the absolute good. So we could die happy at that point. Whereas, in fact, we're always wanting more, seems to be the human condition. We shall never cease from exploration, as T.S. Eliot wrote in his poem. And in fact, this is actually in line with what Plato says about our knowledge of the good in the Republic, that it's that which motivates us all and something we're always, in a way, kind of blindly grasping after, but that is never attainable in a final or complete way by us. And it's, of course, a big theme of the Neoplatonic tradition when talking of the one. But of course, the latter isn't the only image Diotima presents us with how we humans satisfy our desire. There's another one that she prefaces that image of the latter with, and that's the one we talked about last time and we'll be talking about again today, which I just mentioned, the image of reproducing in the beautiful, a process that is, in a sense, never satisfied because it's in principle unsatisfiable. And that is, in another sense, and yet in another sense, it is being satisfied all along. And I'll get to what I mean by that in a little bit. So attaining to the good by reproducing in beauty at first may seem to have nothing to do with knowledge and philosophy at all, except that Diotima has mentioned this idea of us being pregnant or fecund, of having this reproductive potential and urge, not just in body, but also in psyche. And then she goes on to explain that this process of giving birth or begetting applies also to philosophy, to our knowledge of the beautiful, the good, the one. Because human knowledge itself is always in process. It's in the nature of human knowing precisely not to be final, because all mortal things are both at the same time stable and in flux. And she tells Socrates, even while each living thing is said to be alive and to be the same, as a person is said to be the same from childhood till he turns into an old man, even then he never consists of the same things, though he is called the same, but he's always being renewed and in other respects passing away, in his hair and flesh and bones and blood and his entire body. And it's not just in the body, but in his psyche also. For none of his manners, customs, opinions, desires, pleasures, pains, or fears ever remains the same, but some are coming to be in him while others are passing away. And what is still far stranger than that is that not only does one branch of knowledge come to be in us while another passes away, and we are never the same even in respect of our knowledge, but that each single piece of knowledge has the same fate. For what we call studying exists because knowledge is leaving us, because forgetting is the departure of knowledge, while studying puts back a fresh memory in place of what went away, thereby preserving a piece of knowledge so that it seems to be the same. And in that way, everything mortal is preserved, not like the divine, by always being the same in every way, but because what is departing and aging leaves behind something new, something not such as it had been. We've talked before about that wonderful closing of this wonderful book, which tells us how this drinking party ended. Not too long before dawn, when the roosters were already starting to crow, the narrator says his source, Aristodemus, awoke after briefly passing out to find almost everyone gone except Socrates and a few others who were still drinking and still arguing, with Socrates eventually seeming to drive home this point that the same person can create both tragedy and comedy. Well, here we have, as we often have with Plato's theory of eros, that poverty and plenty, that tragedy and comedy. We've already talked a bit about what you could call the tragic side of Platonic love. And this is that because we have this natural desire for an object, the good, beautiful one, that is, in fact, not an object, something that is not really a something, it will always elude us. Our quest for it can always be expressed negatively in this almost Sisyphean way, as a process that is by its nature doomed to never attain its goal. You remember the myth of Sisyphus repeatedly trying to push a boulder up a hill. It's infinite and we're finite, and so it's as though we see only facets of it that leave us yearning for more facets. And so our knowledge of it, in a way, is ever slipping from us and ever needing to be reconstructed. I've spoken a lot in this series about Platonic hope, and here's where I think much of this Platonic hope resides. On the other side, on the comedic or positive side, the side of plenty. Amid all this scheming and planning and struggling that this barefoot and vagabond Eros gets up to. All the while, the good, beautiful, or one has never really been outside of it. Love would never leave us alone, and its object that is not an object has been immanent all along. The entire process has been going on in some way in the beautiful. In a sense, the attainment is in the journeying itself. It's in that constant act of begetting or giving birth, in all our myriad and mundane acts. I think another way of saying all this is that this object of Eros, the beautiful or the good or the one, is not just transcendent. It's, as I mentioned a minute or so ago, it's also immanent. And here I think is where we start to challenge our modern notion of cognition. If we already know the good in some way through each moment of our lives, in every act we perform, not just acts of reasoning, but in our actions as such, in all our begettings and givings birth, you could say, then it must follow that our knowledge of the good happens through action. Our knowledge of the good is in some sense kinetic. It is in and through the action, not of some separated reasoning mind, but of the whole self, the human concretion of body and soul. And so this is actually pretty far from an idea of truth as a mere correspondence of a mental representation with an external object. We're talking, you could say, about the peace that passeth all understanding, which can also be expressed, I think, as the joy of life, the joy that passeth all understanding. The joy, I think the same joy that Aristotle in his Metaphysics talks about being the principle of our cosmos. And here I'm reminded of this short poem by Wallace Stevens called Life is Motion. In Oklahoma, Bonnie and Josie, dressed in calico, danced around a stump. They cried, "Oh ho, yah-ho, ho ho," celebrating the marriage of flesh and air. And so, why is this doctrine of Diotima's so liberating? Well, I think it's fair to say that one theme of this series is that our thoughts can become a kind of prison. And we see this in the human story both communally or politically, the way societies can end up enslaving themselves to these fixed ideals, sometimes with the most horrific results, or individually in the way that we can isolate ourselves from both hope and reality. To again quote T.S. Eliot, from the warm reality, the offered good. We isolate ourselves from these things with our rigid and constrictive thoughts, with our assumptions. And there's this U2 song, which is actually talking about existential despair, the chorus of which runs, "You've got to get yourself together. You've got stuck in a moment and now you can't get out of it." I think it's in our nature as thinking beings to be prone to moments like these. And so how do we get unstuck from them? Well, I think the first step is to recognize, as Marsilio Ficino did, that Diotima's teaching was in some sense inspired and a, quote, life-saving manna sent from heaven, unquote. The object that we yearn for, that will always elude us because it is not an object, it's better than any object. The meaning of life we yearn to know is far richer than any meaning that could be put to words or confined to human thought, better than anything that can be boiled down, anything that can be reduced to a formulation. All well and good, you might say, but still, being human, we yearn to attain it, to seize it in some way. I think, if perhaps for no other reason than to guide our action, or at least to a great extent for that reason. So how do we do this? Well, that's what I'll be talking about really in the next few episodes as we finally start to round out this series. I hope you can join me then. And until next time, be well, and thanks for watching.